I'm Tomás Ybarra-Frausto. My classmates call me Tommy. They translated my name from Spanish. I was born in a little town called New Braunfels, and then I moved to San Antonio, but I grew up in San Antonio on the west side, telling you this story, which is my story and the story of Tommy Ybarra in San Antonio and how he was part of the McNay Art Institute and the San Antonio cultural community. Tommy was very interested in the arts, and he was interested in the arts and the collections at the McNay and at the San Antonio Museum of Art. Tommy Ybarra was especially familiar with the McNay because he had met a Latvian painter, a Latvian graphic artist who came to the McNay to give some lessons at the McNay. McNay had an art school at that time. And what had happened was like this. It's another story within a story. Tommy was at Brackenridge High School, and one day in the Brackenridge newspaper, there was an ad, and it said, Latvian painter, Latvian graphic artist here in San Antonio is asking for somebody to teach his wife Spanish. And so Tommy applied, and he got the job. Now, this was a very important point in my knowledge about art because I met Aja Yonkers when he was teaching at the McNay, and Mrs. Yonkers stayed at home. Now, the Yonkers had bought a house near Brackenridge High School, and so they had a beautiful library full of books that they had brought from Europe that talked about European art, that also, she was very interested in folk art, and she was they were very interested in folk art, they were interested in all sorts of art. And so they let Tommy use the library, and he would spend hours reading about all of this art from Europe, art from Latin America, art from the US, contemporary, historic. And so he got a good education, something that wasn't provided in many of the high schools. He was learning privately from this Latvian painter and his wife. Now, they, of course, were since he taught at the McNay, they were privy to all kinds of dinners and so on at the McNay. So they brought in Tommy. And here was Tommy, a little high school student, learning. Now, it was interesting because now that I remember, they have dinners up in the galleries where they had all the old masters. And even though there were old masters on the wall, everybody was smoking, you know. Everybody was smoking and talking. And this was a time of John Palmer Leeper, who was the director, and also Amy Freeman Lee. And they became very important to Tommy because they would talk about acquisitions and things that they were buying for the McNay. And Tommy used to listen, and he found out. Now, remember, this was a time before any kind of digital stuff. All the discussions about it, when they were going to bring some painter to come to the McNay, they would have a carousel, and they would have slides, and they would show the slides, and they would talk about this artist and why he was important and why he would fit into the McNay's collections. And so Tommy would listen very carefully and learned again a lot of the art that he was learning from this analog before digital collections. And of course, later on, the McNay is now very important in terms of digital collections and whatever. But anyway, at that time, it was from carousels. Now, people don't even know what a carousel is because it's part of the tradition from a long time ago. Tommy was especially welcome at the McNay as a friend of Aja Yonkers, the Latvian printmaker. And so he would come visit and learned a lot about the acquisitions and the building of a collection, and especially Mrs. McNay's collection of Southwestern art. He was particularly interested in her collection of santos and her collection of Southwest weavings and her collection of jewelry. And he learned, because he was also interested when they acquired that wonderful paintings of Diego Rivera and Mrs. McNay's collection of Mexican graphic art. So again, he was very proud that the McNay had art from his homeland, his mother patria. Even though he was born in the US, he was also very interested in the Mexican mural movement and in the Mexican graphic art that the McNay bought. Especially, he was very proud when they bought this Delfina Flores. Yeah, he didn't remember now, but he went and saw it, and he was very proud of all this collection that they were buying. One day, he listened to Amy Freeman Lee, and she gave a lecture on this painter named Consuelo Amezcua, Chelo Amezcua, a painter from Del Rio, Texas. And he was very interested because although McNay had a collection of Mexican prints, they did not have any Mexican-American collection. And so he was very interested when Amy Freeman Lee championed this woman painter, also another woman, because women were not really part of the major, there were some women like Georgia O'Keeffe and so on, Frida Kahlo that were known, but women were not coming into their own yet till much later. And so he was very interested when Amy Freeman Lee talked about Chelo Consuelo Amezcua from Del Rio. And Tommy listened very carefully. And then he went to visit her. He went to visit Chelo because he was very interested in her work. She was considered an outside artist. Chelo painted, she worked as a clerk at a Cres in Del Rio, Texas. And she was a woman who, at one time, she had gotten a scholarship to the San Carlos Academy in Mexico, but her father died and she couldn't take the scholarship. And so she stayed in this little town on the border and kept on working in her painting. What she did was she would paint on cardboard, small little cardboard size, and she would use colored ink and colored pencils, and she would very meticulous make whorls within whorls and scratches and so on. And she was considered an outsider artist because she painted what she dreamt. She would wake up in the morning and would say something like, "Last night, Netzahualcoyotl, the Aztec prince, came to me and he said, 'Paint me a portrait.' And so I did. I painted a portrait of Netzahualcoyotl." Now, this was strange because she was interpreting her dreams, and it was like some people called her maybe a surrealist painter. Some people call her an outsider painter. She had her own, she called her paintings Texas filigree, because it was like filigree, like jewelry, filigree jewelry. But she also not only painted Mexican, she would have dreams. Like one night she said, "Last night the Queen of Sheba came to visit me." And so she painted a portrait of the Queen of Sheba. Or last night I had a visit from the Sphinx and a Pharaoh, and she painted the Pharaoh. And so Amy Freeman Lee was her champion, and she wanted to have probably the first Mexican-American artist that was brought in. I think, if I remember correctly, the show that Amy Freeman Lee had of Chelo Amezcua was not at the McNay. I think it was at the public library in the small gallery that they had. But the McNay bought one of Chelo's paintings, one of Chelo's artworks. And so I was very proud and very happy that the McNay was probably the first museum in San Antonio that had a Mexican-American women artist in their collection. Most of them had, women artists from Mexico and Central America and so on. But the McNay, in a special case, bought this special portraits of Chelo Amezcua. And so Tommy, again, was very happy that he, in some ways, because he had also gone to Del Rio, he also felt he was part of the committee, even though he was not part of the committee because he was, young, that he was very glad that Chelo Amezcua now joined American. He began thinking, well, Mexican-American art is American art. American art is Mexican-American art, even though much later ethnic art, Afro-American art, and Chicano art came into collections maybe in the 1960s, so on. The McNay was one of the first, if not the first, museum in Texas. Mrs. McNay had also championed another, another before Chelo Amezcua. Mrs. McNay had bought the, had paid for another Mexican-American artist from San Antonio named Carlos Rios. She paid for him to go to the Art Institute in Chicago, but then he's gone from the record. I don't know that the McNay has anything, or maybe they have something in the files about Carlos Rios. But in any case, it just shows that Mrs. McNay had a very widespread idea of what American art was like, because she had bought Chelo Amezcua and she had also paid for Carlos Rios to go to the Art Institute. The record is now very misty about Carlos Rios, but it would be interesting to find out and to see what happened to what his artwork was like and what happened to his work. I think that the McNay is a major museum because of the inquisitiveness and the wherewithal of its founder. There were very few home museums. The Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, a couple of others that I can think of that were house museums, but she donated her home, and she was also very broad in her, much more than the other house museums. Like Isabella Gardner was mainly European. They didn't have any indigenous art. They didn't have any art that was not only popular art or vernacular art, but also high art. So the really important thing of the McNay up to this day, I think, again, it follows because contemporarily, the McNay had the first Spanish-speaking director at one time, and he made sure that a lot of the labels were in Spanish and in English. And his logo was, El McNay es su casa. The McNay is your home. And so he brought in the Mexican-American community as part of the reality of San Antonio, which is really, the largest ethnic community in San Antonio and in the U.S. is a Mexican-American community. And so the McNay is at the foreground of opening up spaces for not only, then they began knowing that there were collectors of Mexican-American art. And so they bought in collections of Mexican-American art that were donated to the McNay. And so the Mexican-American community felt, if I were a student right now, I would be very proud because I could come here to the McNay and see parts of my culture. And I would feel that the McNay opened its doors, opened its heart, opened its traditions to my culture, my traditions, my multiple traditions, because I'm not only a scholar of Latino art, I also know about Afro-American art
and of course European art in all its phases. And so the McNay is at the foreground, and it all has to do with its founder. Mrs. McNay had a wide ranging from the very beginning, much more than Sama or any of the galleries in San Antonio, who were, very focused, very tightly focused on one group. She had a very broad notion of what American art was like. From the very beginning, she bought, indigenous art, art from the Southwest, santos, blankets, and she also had a very broad notion. It was only not fine art, it was also folk art, vernacular art, whatever you want to call it. But she had a great imagination and imagined a museum that would show what later became art of the Americas. Not only the U.S. what my father had told me, the United States is not a country. The U.S. is part of a hemisphere. You're an American, and she also believed America is wide. It has many, many, many European, but also many indigenous, many home traditions. And so again, the McNay is at the foreground and remains a very important American meaning multiple American cultures museum. As I started to write, I'm not an art historian, but because there were not many art historians during the 60s or 80s of the Chicano movement, I started writing about Chicano art. And I wrote an essay called Rasquachismo, a Chicano Sensibility. And it was an essay that has been reproduced in many, many forms. 40 years later, people are still talking and debating about what is rascuache, what is rascuachismo. When I met the De la Torre brothers on the border, I'm also very interested in borderlands and the idea of people crossing borders of style, borders of technique, borders of sensibilities. And the De la Torre brothers do all of this. I met them and I was so impressed with their work. First of all, they're brothers, and there are very few sibling artists that work together. They've worked together since the beginning, and so they work very carefully together. Also, they're glass artists from Chihuly, or very few. There are other American glass major artists, but not the way that the De la Torre brothers incorporate all these traditions of rascuachismo, high art, vernacular art, the art of Mexico, pre-Columbian, all of this in a mixture. I was so impressed with their work that I gave a lecture about them, and this is how I met them. I gave a lecture about them at the Louvre in Paris. Paris was having an exhibition of artists that came from so-called, vernacular traditions, and they had shown some of the work of the De la Torre brothers. So they invited me to go and talk about rascuachismo and how this felt in part of the. And when I went to Paris, they went with me. We had a wonderful time in Paris. I got to know them very well. And the lecture was very well received in Paris, because there were a lot of immigrant groups in Paris that lived in different sections of Paris, and they were painting and doing work that was very related to their vernacular cultures like rascuachismo. So they asked a lot of questions about rascuachismo, and we felt, well, this is another form of American art. And so the De la Torre brothers were very significant for me. And I also noticed how I love the way that they move through worlds, multiple worlds of cultures and traditions and myths and so on, and they use it all to incorporate into their work. And so when they dedicated their exhibition right now, to me, I was very humbled, because they're such great artists. But we also continued. They know now that when I got their catalog and saw their work, that, you know, they again also were telling me that rasquachismo was part of the basis for their work. And so I feel very humbled, but very proud. And I know that the exhibition right now at the McNay is causing a lot of commotion, a lot of talk, because it's such a wonderful new take on glass art and on American art. My dreams of the McNay in the next epoch is that it continues expanding its collection of American art, and of course that it continues buying, you know, the new generation, the Latinx generation, a generation that doesn't make any, any connections between, you know, we're this and we're that. We're American, we're Latinos, we're complete people. Also, the newer areas of collecting, queer and, you know, people that don't identify as one gender, multi-gendered communities of artists. All of these are new grounds for collecting. And I think the McNay stands because its founder, Mrs. McNay, was very wide in her assessment, and so I know now she opened the door. The museum now has the historic and contemporary focus on all these new genders, multiple communities of genders, multiple art, which will enrich its collection and will make it again one of the most important museums in the United States or globally, because now Mexican-American artists are showing in Berlin, in Paris, in London. They're American in the widest sense. And the museum, the McNay, has always been American in the wider sense. And I hope it continues this important tradition.